Okay, I'm ready to send this object to Mudbox. Mudbox is an extension of Maya that is built for refining models, adding a lot of detail, adding more complexity, more subdivisions, and also painting textures. They also have it has other tools like some pose tools for rigging a model, and then also some tools for retopologizing. The two that I want to focus on this week for Mudbox are sculpting and painting textures. So we already went over how to lay out UVs, so lay out the kind of map and the way that this three-dimensional object gets processed in 2Ds for applying 2D image-based textures to it. And so now we're ready to send this over to Mudbox. And sending to Mudbox is really easy. Actually, Mudbox and Maya can kind of talk to each other throughout your modeling process. So there's no need to save this and then open Mudbox and then reopen the file. Very quickly, you can kind of work back and forth between the two by going to Send to Mudbox here under File and then go over to Send as New Scene. And it will send your scene to Mudbox, and now we have our model here. And this is the interface for Mudbox. We have a couple different views. I have my 3D view, I have my UV view. So this is what my UVs that I've brought over from Maya look like, really nice and clean. And then I have an image browser, which I think is a kind of like running list of all of the images that you have that you can work with. And then over to the right, I have a couple tabs. I have a layers tab where I can work in layers. I have my list of objects that basically replicates the list of the objects that are in our Maya scene from our outliner. And then I have viewport filters, so what I'm seeing in my viewport, and I wouldn't worry about any of this stuff right now. Down at the bottom of our viewport, I have the paint tools that we're going to be using, the two kind of panels or tabs that we're going to be looking at, or the sculpt tools and the paint tools, and we're going to start with the sculpt tools. Now let me just go back to Maya really quickly and show you what happens if we are actually sending this original paint tube. Let me go ahead and hide this new one that I've created and turn back on the original with its with the mesh being kind of funky as it is here, and the typology not wrapping around in working in edge loops. If I go ahead and let's send this to Maya as a new scene, what we get is we get this kind of error. And what it's saying is that it's detected problems in the mesh. And this is why creating a mesh that has a clean mesh that has really good topology and really good flow around it, that doesn't have vertices that are lying on top of each other or faces that are at the same exact place in the program, too many sides in a face, right? So the boundary of at least one face in the mesh comprises more than 16 edges. So we know which one that is. It's kind of the flat face that's on the top of the tube. And so it won't subdivide properly. And then there's crossing UV boundaries. The mesh has faces where corners lie on the same line. And so these are the different types of problems that you might have. And so you won't be able to work. You can say keep this mesh, but then when you're working on it in Maya, you can see, in Mudbox, you can see where all the problem areas are. So it's not able to understand. It has this red kind of line saying this is a problem area, and the center is also a problem area. So this is why you want to have models that have a really good flow around them, something that makes sense, so that when you start to add subdivisions, it's able to subdivide really well. And also so that if you end up deforming it or animating with it, that it has like the right kind of flow. Also 3D printing, because if you're 3D printing something, it's 3D printing based on coordinates. So it's printing based on the kind of layout, or not necessarily always the way things, it processes it in a certain way. But having, trying to keep your models as clean as possible, you're going to end up getting a better 3D print. You're going to end up getting a much better result if you're working in this kind of program or working with animating in Maya. So let's go back to Maya here, and let's actually just delete this paint tube and turn back on our final. And let's go ahead and send this guy back to Mudbox. And what's really nice about Mudbox is that I can add subdivisions and I can add detail and complexity here, but also kind of keep my original version. It kind of stores a history. So if I go up to Mudbox and go to Mesh, I can add a new subdivision level, and you'll see that now our each one of our faces has been divided into 4, and it's telling us, I don't know if you saw that little dialog box up here, but it's giving us a count of how many polygons are in our model. This is something that I've actually asked you for this project, is to keep your original Maya models, so this original model here, and what I've done just so that I know how many faces I have, I've gone again, I think I went over this in an earlier video because I like to use this tool, heads up display and poly count under display, and this gives me a running tab of whatever I have selected and then how many vertices, edges, faces. So my object is actually under 200. I'm asking you to keep it under 500 because, I mean, this is a very simple model. I modeled this in, 15 minutes or something using curves. So create a model that's maybe twice as complex as this tube, but maybe not as complex as your model from last week. And then try to, using this poly count, try to keep it under 500 faces. And so now I've doubled that, and or I've actually quadrupled it, right? So it's divided it in half both directions. So I'm at 774, and maybe I'm going to go up and I'm going to add another subdivision level because this is still looking a little bit it's looking a little bit faceted and sharp around my corners here. So let me go back up to Mesh and say add a new subdivision level. And now I think, and see it says 3,096 polygons now in this model. So you can start to get really complex models really quickly by using subdivisions, but the amount of detail now that you can work with when you are sculpting is a lot higher. And so maybe having 2 subdivision levels is maybe a good place to kind of start. I can always go down by saying level down or level up to see a model that is more or less complex than what it basically is storing the history of my model. So it's storing a kind of base level, and then it's storing all my levels up. So I'm able to actually send this back to Maya with all the subdivisions added, or I can kind of work in between them. It's not like I'm just adding divisions and then I'm starting to sculpt in Maya, and then I'm like, oh, this model's like way too complex, it's too cumbersome, like what am I, I want to go back down. It's kind of like you can't necessarily reduce the amount of divisions in your model as easily in Maya as you can here, because it's keeping a kind of history, and it's keeping different levels of your subdivisions within the same object. So I can kind of show you, we can go back and look at what the detail that I've created using the sculpt tools, what it looks like at different levels. So our sculpt tools are right here, and let me turn these off for a second just because I just want to be dealing with sculpting. I'll get into this in a second. And so it's very simple to start sculpting in Maya. Let me make sure I'm at my top level here, and I am. I'm at the highest level. I can add a level by pressing Shift D. It's telling me if I want to add even more complexity. And so what I can do is just kind of start to use some of these tools. Sculpt kind of pulls things out, and what I can do is I can change the size of my brush. I can type in a value, or I can use the sliding scale, and I can also increase the strength here. And so you're going to have to play around. I mean, it's kind of an arbitrary number, 1 to 100 for each of these sliding scales. So you're going to have to go find the values that work for what you want to do. But and I think actually I still have something on here. Okay, let me turn my stamp and stencil off. So now this will just give me a very even sculpting. And so with sculpting, I'm kind of pulling out, in this case, pulling out this isn't necessarily what I want to be doing to this tube, but I'm just going to use it as a way to demonstrate my tools down here. So sculpt allows you to kind of pull up, straight up, and kind of like mold your model by pulling up on the mesh. Okay, and smooth, I think, will do the opposite of that. It will smooth out what you have sculpted. If we go to relax, what this will do is it will kind of smooth, but in a way that's much more refined, where it's kind of, if you can see exactly what it says it does, it kind of relaxes your previous, kind of blends between the different areas to kind of flatten, blends between them. Grab allows you to pull the mesh out. Let me increase the strength here. So grab allows you to kind of, in a direction that you're pulling in, kind of pull, grab the mesh and pull and manipulate it this way. I'm going to undo all of this. And pinch allows you to kind of pinch and pull different sections of your model. And it actually looks like it kind of pinches in on itself rather than grabbing and pulling up. So it's kind of like pinching into the mesh. Flatten will kind of flatten the mesh. Let me increase the strength here. And this might be a good tool for my paintbrush, for my paint tube here, is to use flatten to make it look as if the paint is being kind of squeezed out of the tube. And maybe I'll go into my smooth and go and kind of smooth that out a little bit. So it's really about kind of working, it's kind of pulling those things into, which I don't really like how smooth worked. I think that just using flatten kind of worked pretty well. Maybe I will want to go in and kind of sculpt this a little bit. Maybe put my strength down to 0.5 and start to kind of like make this a little bit deformed up here. And so what I want you to do is just kind of work with these sculpt tools to change the form of your model, to increase its subdivisions, and to sculpt it. So whatever you ended up modeling or will end up modeling, and I'd like you to use these tools initially to start to add some complexity to the form, adding some detail. I would really like to maybe be able to move these vertices up a little bit in the back. And maybe pull them out too. I don't like the way it's kind of getting shrunk in the back. So pull these out. Okay, so those are using with a kind of, and what we can do here actually is we can change the fall off, meaning that if I'm going into my sculpt tool, I don't know why I have this on, I can go under fall off down here and I can change the fall off is kind of the gradient from the value into nothing around the brush size. So if I change this curve like to something like this where the fall off is really steep, and let me actually decrease the brush size up here to like 0.5, I'm getting a really sharp sculpt. And then, you know, if I change this fall off to look something like this, I'm actually changing, you know, how smooth that is. In this case, like how big my brush is, really. Let me go and pull this all the way up, maybe. And you can see the difference there, okay? So fall off is kind of a good thing to play with. And then lastly, we have stamps and stencils. And stamps are an image that is kind of projected within the size of the brush itself. And let me increase the size of my brush, 1.5. And you can kind of see how this is going to work. Let me increase the strength to 1. And what it does is it allows me to kind of paint this. I've selected this texture. This it's a TIFF, I believe. If I hover over this, I can see that it's a TIFF. This is black and white acid metal TIFF. So this is how you make something have a texture of acid metal. I'm not really sure, I guess. But you're able to add texture really easily here. So like in Maya, you're able to add texture with like bump maps, which are super complicated. They're not super complicated. We're definitely not getting into it, and especially not if you can add texture like this to your model. Or normal maps, like bump maps are basically a kind of JPEG that gets used as a texture over your model through UVs, and it gives the illusion of it having a kind of a bumpy surface, when really, if you look at the renderer, it's still like a smooth mesh. And then a normal map is something that you would use to like actually add through UVs, and through texturing through UVs, you'd be able to then add actual bumps to your model, or actual textures. And here it's so much easier. You can just kind of paint them on and make your model more complex. But this is something that like where the amount of subdivisions that you have really does matter. If I go up and I add another subdivision level and use this tool, I'm getting so much like richer detail. But again, now, I mean, I don't remember, what did it say? Let's see what it says. So I'm at 12,000 polygons now. And so think about just how, I mean, that's a lot of polygons, and something like a gaming engine only allows you to kind of, this is why a lot of games look the way that they do, kind of low poly style, is because the processing power of animating objects that have like really high poly counts, it becomes very taxing. And so depending on the game engine or the console that you're using, you know, older consoles had like less power to be able to do that, and like newer ones have more power to be able to compute higher res models. But anyway, so you want to make sure that you're adding complexity to your model that, you know, makes sense for what the model is. If this is a paint tube that's going to be on a table somewhere, I mean, that amount of detail is kind of enough. I don't necessarily have to like go crazy with it, but I do want to just show you, you know, whatever your model is, maybe your model is something a little bit larger and needs some detail to it. And so you can use stencils to do so, or stamps here to do so in this particular fashion. Stencils are kind of like stamps, except that they add a kind of image to the UI kind of screen here. So a flat kind of, it's flatly projected, and then you're able to kind of use this tool this way. Here are some, this is a little legend down here. So if I press S and then the right mouse button, I'm able to scale this down. I'm able to move it by, you know, somewhere in this screen here like this. And then what it will do is wherever it's white, that's where the tool will be applied. So if I go back to my sculpt tool, let me make my brush a lot bigger. My sculpt tool. Maybe make it 2.5. And then go back to my stencil and make sure my stencil's still on here. And now, you know, you see that my stencil, so my brush size is what it is with the fall off, so that's why it's getting bumpy. But anywhere outside of that, the white part of my stencil the brush isn't being applied. Okay, so stencils are kind of interesting to use. Some of these tools are really great when we're painting, and we'll get into that in the next video. You can also add your own stencils and stamps by going Add Stencil or Add Stamp here. And again, like to add, you can see what these are. You know, all of these I think are pings. So you'd want to be creating a square ping that is that you can then add here to your list of. I've already done that here where I've created this thing that says Acrylic Paint Company, and that's kind of silly, but it's actually using this. Using my stencil here that I created, that I imported to apply a kind of raised texture. I'm actually thinking of using this for when I paint, to paint on a kind of label to my tube. But anyway, that's for next video. So go ahead and kind of add complexity to your model through sculpting and through increasing subdivisions. And then once I'm kind of done sculpting this, and the other thing that I kind of want to do, and let's see if I can, maybe I can like grab and maybe make my brush like really big. Maybe I can grab all of this part of the tube and kind of pull it up a little bit. I would love to be able to kind of rotate it, but I don't know. I mean, that's something that maybe I can do in Maya. So you're going to want to work in between Maya and Mudbox to get the kind of result that you want. So let me go ahead. I just want to clean this up a little bit more, flatten this out. Maybe I want to put, yeah, like, I kind of like the way that was looking if I kind of go like that a little bit, right? And so now I have a tube of paint that looks like it's been used a little bit. And now if I want to go and File, Send to Maya, send as a new scene. Maya's gonna, nothing is selected. The entire scene will be sent. That's fine. There's only one thing in it. And then I have the option of sending what's at the base level. Actually, before I send this to Maya, let me go ahead and show you. If I go and go step level down, it'll show you what this looks like at this level. If I go step level down again, well, when I send this back to Maya at these different levels, it's not going to really maintain this shape. We can start to see it does become a little bit more faceted. Let me go step level down to the base level. Okay, there we can kind of see that the amount of detail in this model, even though it does have its, it does have some of the deformations that I've done with the sculpt tool. It has far less detail. So now I can kind of find a level that I like of detail. I think that this level 2 looks pretty good. And now I'm going to go to File, Send to Maya, update current scene. Can do that. Entire scene will be sent, and send meshes at the current level. Mesh not updated. Let's see. Okay, because I said update current scene. So let me go back and instead say send to Maya, send selected as a new scene. Nothing is selected. Okay. Send meshes at the current level. Don't save, or actually maybe I will save this. Yeah, I will save it. I don't need that other. Okay, and there we have it. There's my new model with the added subdivisions and all of my sculpting. And so if I go now also to my attribute editor here, I have this Lambert 2. So it changed color a little bit, because in Mudbox it gave it a kind of, gave it a different material preset. So I don't have my Lambert 1 applied here. Now I have Lambert 2. It's a little bit brighter. Okay, so that's it for this video. When we come back, we will go into painting.